So in one of the talks that you gave, there you mentioned something about philosophers building these complex theoretical houses, but not actually living in them. Could you elaborate on that a bit more?
Yeah, that's actually an idea I took from Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher. Yeah, he made that comparison, which I found very interesting. And for me, it really translates to the difference between academic philosophy and ancient philosophy as a way of life. So there's a huge difference between both practices, and one is really concerned with existence, day-to-day life, and the other is really an academic exercise, which is also interesting but completely different.
Mm-hmm. And I think we would both agree today we're leaning more towards the theoretical than the actual practical, right? Um, what are the things we can take from both?
Mm.
What are some of the virtues that might be linked to more practical and more to theoretical? Because we've leaned towards the theoretical side for a reason, I presume, right? Or has it just happened organically over time?
Okay, so the theoretical and the practical have always belonged together. So it's not like suddenly theory was invented or something. So, my main source of inspiration comes from Pierre Hadot, a French academic who studied the ancients, and he suggested that ancient philosophy was born out of existence. So first you could call it its practice. But then, to become philosophy, you need to theorize about practice. So, without any theory, there's no philosophy. So, um, people start to think about what they experienced, how they could respond differently to practical situations, such as the Stoics, as you mentioned in your introduction. And then theory was taken back to practice again. So let's see if it works. Let's see if our ideas actually, take form in practice. So it's a constant interaction between both theory and practice, and therefore it's a bit misleading to suggest that both, are separate because they are intertwined and they belong together. But you're right in saying that there's at least a shift in emphasis. An academic philosopher today still is involved in practical things somehow. Writing articles, discussing papers and stuff is a practice as well. But it's very narrowly focused on and on intellectual aspects of philosophy. And these intellectual aspects are usually called theory, the theory of philosophy. And these also played a role in the ancient conception of philosophy, but it was just one of the many aspects that
Mhm.
involve philosophy. So what you could say, I think, is that the shift that has happened ever since the introduction of universities has been much more towards the intellectual side of philosophy, and all the existential aspects and even physical aspects have been yeah, kind of neglected. And the reason for that is very complex, but and also encompasses many centuries of development. Philosophy going from um, pre-Christian times, entering a completely new religious paradigm, and then coming to the secular world. But what we have now is still very reminiscent of the religious practice of philosophy, in the sense that what these pre-Christian philosophers had to say about life is not so interesting, because we have God and we have the Bible now, where we can find answers to complex questions. But it's still interesting to look at kind of the arguments of ancient philosophers and the way they wrote and spoke.
Mhm. But those practices you mentioned of writing and giving talks and stuff, they seem somehow still inwards towards developing more theory. And I think the Stoic way of looking at it should be that those theories should be pointing you outwards into the world, right? Giving you practices to go into the world, not
Absolutely, yeah.
to turn inwards more and develop more theory.
Yeah. Um, Absolutely. So Stoic philosophy is really meant to be applied, and it's only interesting to a certain point to talk about it. And for me, I've reached a point that I think, talking about it is, it's not so difficult to understand. So Stoic philosophy is quite easy, and it's there's not really much point in theorizing much more about it because it's very clear. Some things, need to be adapted, obviously. So there's a very different cosmological kind of foundation, presupposing certain, the existence of gods, for instance, and these kind of things. Obviously, we've moved away from that now, but it's still perfectly fine to translate the most fundamental ideas into today's context. And these ideas are, yeah, as you mentioned, it's very, very easy to understand and extremely hard to apply. So I think what's most interesting and what good philosophers should do is kind of assist this process of translating um, the theory into concrete life. And this is something that philosophers are also limited in what they can do, but because I don't think they should actually tell other people what they should do, but guide people into finding their own answers to the question of what they should do.
So basically, what we're doing today is completely pointless because
No, no, not at all. But I think it's added of added value because Stoicism is often presented as a list of here's a list of things you should do in your life, and then you will become Stoic or you'll live as a Stoic. And I think this is very misguided, and most of the modern popular representations of Stoic philosophy are very misguided and also misleading because I think Stoicism is extremely hard to apply, and probably very few people are capable of doing
yeah,
it.
it's not something you can do after watching one YouTube video.
No way, no way.
But before we go into
Yeah.
the depths of Stoicism, those three giants that I mentioned, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus, um, what I was wondering about them is if they were writing with the idea of we are Stoics and we're producing Stoic work, or is it more that afterwards we've observed this trend through their writings and then applied this label of Stoic to them?
That's a great question. So let's start with Seneca because chronologically he's the first of the Roman Stoics. Obviously, Stoicism is much older, and started in the Greek world. But we mostly talk about the Roman Stoics because their literature is more widely available. Lots of the Greek sources have been lost. Um, so Seneca. Seneca, he actually wrote most of his text in the form of letters to a certain Lucilius, and it's not known exactly who he was, but it's probably someone with from an elite background in the Roman state.
He was very rich though, right? There's something about that
Seneca,
some dubious way he managed it.
yeah,
Very rich.
it is said that he got rich because he supposedly lent out money against extremely high rates of interest. But he was also, he had a very high position in the Roman system. At ending as an advisor to Nero. So obviously with that comes wealth. But he also had ideas about how to think about wealth, how to act, especially as a wealthy person. But that's what's interesting. He wrote his letters to one person, but he must have known that more than one person would have read them because he also is clearly building an image of himself, a public image as a public figure. He was a public figure. So
Was it actually a real person? Do we know that he
Said-
was writing? No, that he was writing to.
Lucilius. So no, it's not exactly known who he was. No. So it has been reconstructed, but no one can say with certainty who he was. But he probably existed. Yeah. It is conceivable that he didn't exist, but I don't think most academics agree on that. It's much more likely. So Seneca, he also wrote to some other people. He also had some letters of consolation, for instance. But he always wrote them in a way that more people could benefit from what he had to say than the recipients themselves. So that's interesting, and it's just because he was a well-known figure and he had some adversaries, and he knew people followed him. If he would have lived in our times, he probably would have had many followers online.
He would have been an influencer.
He would have been an influencer. So that's as far as Seneca goes, but Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius are very different. Epictetus was a born slave, so from a very different background. And he became famous as a teacher, but not as a writer. So Epictetus himself didn't write anything. It was his students that kind of wrote texts from his lectures. And these, were not that widespread. So I think Epictetus is more like a figure that had many followers, physical followers, and students in that sense. So he wasn't that famous. He became very famous afterwards, and I think also, through the centuries, Epictetus' work is probably has had most prints. So, for instance, the Enchiridion, his pocketbook, has been printed since the Renaissance, and there's been so extremely great amounts of copies found, and every year it's reprinted in a different language. But back then, so he didn't write, so it was not a public figure in the tradition of Seneca. And Marcus Aurelius is yet another extreme case of an emperor who just kept a journal. So his meditations were not meant to be read by anyone really, other than himself. So it was just a personal journal and an exercise in that sense of trying to become a Stoic. And in that sense, it's a very fascinating work to read because you can really get a sense of the struggles he went through, not only as an emperor in a difficult time in history, but especially as someone trying to become a Stoic and failing to become one.
But he was setting out to become a Stoic.
Well, he was very clearly, he put himself in the tradition of Epictetus, so he called himself a student of Epictetus. And in that sense, yes, he was trying to become Stoic, but he was a very influential person, obviously, and had many teachers around him who tried to influence him. And one of them is Fronto. And he tried actually to make Marcus Aurelius into someone who's very interested in rhetoric. And Stoicism, he didn't like at all his teacher. But Marcus himself was drawn to Stoicism, so it must have been a personal choice.
Yeah, I find his writings, like for an emperor 2,000 years ago, they're so relatable.
Yeah.
So the chapters of him talking about struggling to get out of bed in the morning, but it's your duty as any other animal in the world has his duty. It's your duty to go into the world as well. Just this struggle of the blankets being so warm, it's so relatable. When it an emperor 2,000 years ago, which is very crazy to me.
Yeah.
But if we look at those three or even more, what are the underlying themes that make us slap the label Stoic on them?
Well, they're all concerned with, for instance, dealing with emotions or dealing with challenging situations. I really liked the way you framed it, saying that, challenges are actually a good thing, something necessary to grow, to test yourself. and to make progress. So, and that's something you will find in all three. Something they recommend, or something they would not walk away from, and experience disappointment, for instance, and misfortune, to kind of try to deal with that somehow.
Okay. And the Stoic teachings were mostly lost through history up until like 70 years ago, right?
No, I don't think that's
No?
true. No, because in the Renaissance, for instance, Michel de Montaigne, he referred to Seneca and others. Hey, Erasmus of Rotterdam also was very aware of Seneca. So
It might be the popularization of it as a cultural force that's very quite recent, right?
yes, so that's certainly so it becoming popular again is definitely something,
Mm.
I guess. Something, yeah, maybe even the 70 years ago would be accurate in that regard, because there were already people, in concentration camps writing about Stoicism, and the way Stoicism helped
Yeah.
them kind of get through the terrible things they experienced there. So Primo Levi is an example. But the kind of the real popularization of Stoicism, where it is linked to being successful in very different ways than the Stoics wrote about. So, in a financial sense, or even successful in sexual terms.
Mhm.
That's really something of the last couple of years.
Yeah, I want to get to that as well. But first, the thing you mentioned about the people in concentration camps referring to Stoicism, what is it they took from that that helped them in that situation?
Well, I think obviously it's very difficult to speak for them, but
Mhm.
knowing Stoicism is mainly about dealing with hardship. There's a clear link. Any kind of hardship. There's a way. There are multiple ways you can relate to your experience, and the Stoics would try to kind of frame any like hardship in a way that you at least don't add any more suffering to it. And there's a very interesting parallel towards Zen Buddhism and Eastern philosophy in that sense. But we can come back to that later. But so I think it's dealing with that, with difficult situations, with extremely difficult situations, and even in human situations.
Because I saw the story of the prisoner of war in, I might have been Vietnam,
Yeah.
who also mentioned that the prisoners who were in this camp that held out hope were the ones that would eventually lose it and perish, and the ones like that held, I guess, more stoic principles where they just accepted their fate and didn't hold out hope that they were going to get rescued tomorrow, but just lived in the experience as it is right now,
As
were the ones that could have lasted the longest.
absolutely, as easy as it sounds. We should add that, because that's a permanent challenge and struggle, but it's a mental one above all. Not in all cases, but but the Stoics were also quite clear about it. If it's a physical pain you're dealing with, you're either gonna die from it, or and if not, you're probably able to deal with it somehow. Because what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. As heroic as that sounds and easy as that sounds, but yeah, and I think so. Then there's the mental aspect. As soon as you kind of give up mentally, then you're gonna lose and to any struggle probably. Whereas the mental game, if that's strong, you're probably more likely to survive any kind of hardship.
I think that kind of links to a concept I think you talked about, which is the premeditatio malum.
Majoris and
Maloris?
mortis. Yeah.
Okay. So what I got from it is that basically when you wake up, you think about all the bad things that could happen to you during the day. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, it's not necessarily something you do in the morning, but you could.
Okay.
Why not? But it's and maybe that's a great idea, but depends on your situation. It's certainly something. It's like a meditation about anticipating a future problem,
Yeah.
or bad situation. And then, contemplating on, what it does to you, why you experience fear, and first, what is it? What is there to experience first of all? And then you kind of you can proceed and move towards thinking about potential solutions or ways to deal with it, yeah, in the future. And it's meant to kind of take away any kind of stress or anxiety in the present.
Well, the only problem I have with it, I guess, isn't there a fine line between this process that you just described and just being pessimistic about life? Isn't it a very fine line between both?
There
Between the
is.
both?
There is, and I think any practitioner should be very conscious of the fine line, and also not to succumb to pessimism. And
Do the Stoics give any help to us on how to avoid falling into this more maybe nihilistic path of pessimism and staying on maybe a more virtuous path?
yeah, it's one of the most important aspects of Stoicism. It's really about memorizing the principles in a way that you have them ready always for whenever there's a moment of doubt. And so that's the spiritual exercise of memorization of principles. And they're really, pessimism is something that'll it'll wear you down. Thinking about, for instance, thoughts about why does this happen to me? Why am I the victim in this situation? That's a very, easy way to think about situations, and a pessimistic way also. But also one that the Stoics would reject vehemently, because they think, that's a thought that shouldn't come up in the first place. We are not victims in any case.
Is it that if you're creating a victim out of yourself, you're making the self too important, whereas the Stoics might reject the self in principle?
That's another dimension of victimhood, for sure. Yeah. Blowing yourself up, or, framing yourself as a victim is also blowing yourself up to the, middle of the universe and making your pain and suffering the more important over the pain and suffering of others, certainly.
And kind of a different subject, but what were their how did they look at the universe? Was there an adamant belief in God among Stoics, or does that not really fit together?
Yes, absolutely. So they lived in a very, religious world, but very different in terms of, monotheistic religion as we know it
Mm.
today. But so an interesting or important concept for the Stoics is providence. So the idea that our fate is predetermined in a sense. So especially as far as the moment we die, or the way we get ill goes. So the kind of the larger picture is all predetermined in the Stoic mind, but then all we have left to focus on is how we relate to the greater good, the greater whole. And yeah, and that's so, and there we have a choice. There's freedom in that, but in the way things progress on a larger scale, we don't have much to say and much influence on that. So
So they're very deterministic,
yes,
and in that determinism, everything's set already. The only thing that is within your control is how you react to what is already being determined.
yes, that's the kind of easy way to
The very simplified
the
version.
simple way to
All right, all
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Do you have a personal favorite among all the Stoics?
I kind of move my personal favorite every now and then, but
They're all between your favorite children, right?
yeah, exactly. So no, I mean, I'd probably say like Seneca is probably my favorite because uh, he has most concern also for style in his writings.
Okay.
So I think his writings are the most joyful to read
Mm.
because he he was just very skilled rhetorician, and he pays much attention to style, and that's, as an person who enjoys to read, that's very pleasant. But also, I think he's funny. He has a great sense of humor, as most of them do, by the way. Epictetus is also hilarious, but again, it's not his writings we kind of have access to, but notes from his students. So that's a bit different, and yeah, I'd have to say Seneca is probably my favorite, but I also really like Musonius Rufus. He's less famous, but also one of the Roman Stoics. And there's less writings accessible, but some of his ideas I can really relate to. He also has this strong kind of warriorship aspect to his writings, and a fighting mentality, which I find really inspiring.
And when you were talking about Aurelius a while back, you mentioned that, I mean, he was setting out to be a Stoic, but he failed in that.
Yeah, as we all do.
Because it seems that, like you already said before, the implementation of it is incredibly hard, and therefore I'm like, how good of a solution can something be if even the people that study it incredibly well and make it their life goal to implement it still fail?
Oh, that's a great question. Let's go back to Seneca first. Seneca said once every 500 years a Stoic is born.
Mm.
Once every 500 years. So the first would have probably been Socrates, where Socrates was, of course, not a self-proclaimed Stoic. He didn't write anything either, but Stoicism wasn't invented in the time of Socrates yet. But almost all of the Stoics kind of agree that he was the most important source of inspiration for the Stoics, and that's just because of his behavior, his attitude towards life, and also because he was a warrior, which was important. So, and then Seneca himself, and I've write about this quite extensively because I find it a very interesting idea. So, who was the second? Because between Socrates and Seneca, there's room for one more Stoic, and it wasn't Seneca himself. So, and then he points towards Cato the Younger, which wasn't a philosopher but a general in the Roman army, one who fought against Caesar and eventually committed suicide. And according to Seneca, he's another example of a Stoic who kind of succeeded in applying Stoicism to the fullest, to the best possible ability. It's a bit random, to be honest, because I could think of other figures who would also kind of fall into that category. But Marcus Aurelius is very interesting because he kind of shifts this focus from a full-blown Stoicism to someone who is just on the way towards on the path of wisdom, on the path of Stoicism. And he says, maybe, and he says this to himself, maybe we shouldn't focus so much on, the end goal, but just on the small progress we made by, trying to apply Stoic philosophy in our lives. And then he said, he has somewhere a quote, we shouldn't hope to create the state, and the state referring to Plato's state, ideal state, but just be happy with a little bit of progress, and don't think that's something, don't disregard that as something small. So the best we, translate it to now and to then also, the best we can probably hope to get out of it is just a little bit of progress. And I think that's realistic still.
That reminds me of a quote by Camus that the journey towards the heights is enough to fill a man's heart.
Yeah.
That's kind of what they're going after, right? It's
Yeah.
just that you don't have to be the Stoic that comes around every 500 years.
No.
It's more that progression towards being better every day, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. And again, there's a parallel to Eastern kind of ways of thinking about philosophy, and as a way.
How does that relate to Eastern philosophy?
Well, the path. It's very often called the path.
Yeah.
And that also
So
suggests
Wu Wei, is that something you're...
Wu Wei is Taoism.
Yeah.
I think there's also a connection to Taoism, but I'm more focused on Buddhism.
Okay.
And also the kind of arts that spiral of Buddhism. So, Chado, which is the art of making tea, Kado, the art of flower arrangements, and of course the Budo, and Budo is all the fighting
Okay.
disciplines, and they all have Do in their names, and Do is the Japanese word for the way. But it's interesting that you mentioned Wu Wei, because that's Taoism, and the word Do comes from Tao,
And that was the way, right?
and that's the way. So
Okay. And yeah, 'cause that leads to the warrior aspect, I guess. Yeah. Because that's, I feel, what one of your books is about as well, right? The implementation of things like martial arts, what they can teach us. Because you are a practitioner of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
mhm.
What has that taught you about Stoic principles?
Well, a lot, and I was surprised about how much it taught me and how much it can still teach me, because I'm still a beginner. I've practiced for 4 or 5 years now. But I think first of all, what comes to mind is I used to practice a lot in the morning.
Okay.
So I took morning classes at 8 o'clock in the morning, and that's the way I start my day with jiu-jitsu. And I always felt like after a session, which is, it's always quite tough. And I always felt like, okay, so the hardest part of the day is over now, and everything else will probably be manageable compared to what I just did. So I found that as a great way to start your day. And it's also a way to kind of, don't think about any, uh, things you experience that feel like, as disappointing. You will see them in a different light if you have already suffered
Yeah.
a fair bit on the mats.
Yes.
So that was one great thing that it taught me. But it also, it's jiu-jitsu. It seems like it's an individual sport, but it's a very much a team effort, I think.
How so?
You at least, if the culture is there, it depends where you train. But in our gym, I would like to think that there's a very strong sense of camaraderie, and that it's really not about individual success, but a team effort of
Okay.
all becoming better at something. And I noticed it most when competing, and I felt like many people from the gym came to support each other, and that felt like a great way of like what it ultimately is about. It's about creating a community of people, training to become better, but not just as jiu-jitsu practitioners, but just as one big community, a family almost. And that translates to the person that you are, and the kind of things that you focus on, and it moves away the focus from egoism to the larger good of a group, for instance. And that, I think, is a very Stoic principle. That Stoicism, in the end, it's not really a life hack or something you do to get personal success, but it's something to move, to help communities move forward. Whatever community you're a part of, and it can, of course, it starts for me. It starts with family and my daughter, and and then gradually you just move your circle of importance and the communities that you're part of, which are many, to greater goods, and you try to elevate other people's well-being and become better in doing so. And it sounds very idealistic, but I think that's really what it's about. And whether you succeed at that or not is largely also out of out of control, but at least it's the effort of doing something for other people and not just for the benefit of yourself. And I think we live in times where that's more important than ever.
And you mentioned the ego.
Yeah.
That's a principle in Eastern philosophy as well, right? The death of the ego.
Yeah.
Is that, because I'm kind of getting the feeling that is what Stoicism might also be revolving around, right? That just you recognize the self, and maybe you don't reject it, but it seems to get close to this ego death thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the notion of the self is just has become very small and narrow about, the self is synonymous to individuals. But back, in Stoic contexts, I think the self is always much, much more than one person. So it's just a different way of relating to selfhood and seeing the self as, a small part of a greater whole. Um, and the Stoics, they had this idea of, they were cosmically conscious, so conscious of what the cosmos is and the fact that it's much more than one person, obviously. So
Could you elaborate on that a bit more? The cosmic conscious, what is that exactly,
yeah,
and how does that relate to it?
well, it's a in simple terms, it's just a realization of knowing that you're only a small part
Mm.
of a greater thing. The world, you could relate to it. The cosmos, you could say, communities, whatever. It's just the idea that there's always something greater than you.
Is that somehow relatable to like Spinoza, that God is in nature? Because they do have these conceptions of the God on a cloud, right? That's influencing and determining your life. But it seems like somehow they're also seeing God in nature.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And in you know the Stoics, I think you could say they were. It's a very religious philosophy, also, just not in the sense as that Spinoza's philosophy was religious, but there's more. There's very interesting parallels, and Spinoza actually also explicitly refers to the
Really?
Stoics again. So there's
Yeah.
there's he kind of draws from Stoic philosophy to kind of develop his own philosophy eventually. I'm not an expert on that, but I know he takes a lot from Stoics, and this idea that nature is divine
Yeah.
is a very Stoic idea.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's very interesting.
yeah,
Something to
yeah,
dive
and
deeper into.
and to kind of continue a little bit and elaborate on it. So the idea is that nature is divine. And the Stoics say it's rational. So um, individuals all have a small part of this divine nature in them by virtue of their capacity to reason. So our capacity to reason, if we use it and become reasonable and act reasonably, that kind of means that we act in accordance with nature. And that's kind of we fulfill our religious uh, connection to the greater whole. So that being
Okay.
cosmically conscious.
Is that what Aurelius is talking about when he's talking about the ant? Well, actually, just animals doing their duty, and that because we're part of nature, our duty is to reason, and therefore you have to get out of bed in the morning, do your task as a
Yes.
human, which is reasoning,
Yes.
and therefore you claim your place in nature.
Yeah, totally.
Mm.
Yeah, that's it. And that's cosmic consciousness in answer to
Okay.
your earlier question. And that also is like the divine kind of message and duty
Mm-hmm.
we all have in a Stoic sense. Now, of course, we don't have to frame it that way anymore, but it's just to put it in a historical context.
And I think that's the biggest difference between what Stoicism set out to be and what it is perceived as today, right? That
Yes.
that Stoicism today is made as something you can apply to achieve a goal, and that goal is something that the ego, something that the self wants to fulfill.
Yes.
Whereas Stoicism, like, you're doing it for the sake of itself. You're not doing it to achieve something to satisfy the ego. You're doing it because it's your duty towards nature.
Yes.
And
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. Well put. And also, but just an addition with the idea of the death of the ego, because
mhm.
that can also be easily misinterpreted, I think. So
Okay.
I think ultimately it's not really about killing the ego,
Okay.
because we all have egos and the ego won't go away. So
Mm.
trying to get rid of it is impossible. And in Dutch, it's called the spirituele valkuil. So it's a trap. I
Yes.
think that it's possible, the spiritual trap. Mm, And there's a very nice analogy in the Buddhist canon. It goes like so first a person starts his journey, goes on the path and then sees like mountains and goes like so or rather the person before going on to the path says mountains are mountains and waters are waters, rivers are rivers. I'm not sure what the word is. Um, then you go on the path. You start your journey and go like, okay, mountains are not mountains. Waters or rivers are not rivers. So things, um, what they seem to be, they're not. So are very different from what we always thought they were. So, for instance, one becomes conscious of one's ego and kind of starts thinking, oh, well, this ego has a lot of influence on who I am and the way I think and the way I act. So I need to get rid of it. It's not me. But then there's another step. So, and that's the third step of someone being spending more time on the path and being farther in their journeys, and that's going back to the idea of mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. So that's kind of then you come back and the circle is completed, and it just means like okay, so the way I interpreted it, and I think many people do, is like the ego is the ego, and it's not something we need to get rid of, but just something we need to be conscious of and kind of understanding how it works and not seeing it as an enemy, but something you can collaborate with somehow. Find a way to facilitate its existence without it being harmful.
Seems very psychological as well.
It is. It's because it is. I think the philosophy I'm interested in is quite psychological, but it's different from psychology in the sense that it also has a concern with what we were just talking about, the larger
Yeah.
whole, the greater good of communities, the world, and the environment, those kind of things. And that's something out of the realm of psychology.
Mm. Yeah, it does seem very psychological. And well, maybe we could talk a bit more about the comparisons between East and West, because I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but it's so fascinating to me that in these parts, complete different parts of the world that weren't in much contact with each other at the time, I don't believe, um, came up with these similar ideas. Do you think it stems from something that was going on around that day on that time, or is it just something so within, like so graved within us that it just comes out naturally?
Yeah, that's a very complex issue, and many people took an interest in this. So it has also been widely written and reported about, but there's no conclusion. For instance, Karl Jaspers, a German philosopher, he wrote about Confucius, I think the Buddha, Christ, and Socrates, all living roughly around the
Yeah.
same age in the 5th century before Christ, all the way to Christ. So roughly 500 years. A lot of stuff happened in that period, but it's quite speculative as to why it was then. And many of the ideas having some kind of similarities. But other people have also kind of pointed towards the journeys undertaken by Alexander the Great, all the way to India, for instance. So he got there with an army of soldiers,
Yeah.
and in that army there were also philosophers who were interested, in these kind of greater questions. And so, but the most certain statement I can make, and I think others can make about it, is that it's likely that there were exchanges between Indian philosophers and Greek philosophers, for instance. But there's no documentation about it, so I think
And
we'll never know.
in Buddhism, there's this enlightened state, right? Is there something similar in Stoicism where you can reach a point, maybe that person that reaches or that comes around every 500 years? Is there
Hmm.
a characteristic, or how do we notice that person when he comes around? How do we notice the enlightened ones?
Well, enlightenment is a very complex idea, I think, and state also that has changed the meaning over the centuries a lot. So I think the oldest kind of idea about enlightenment is basically you stop reincarnating, so
Yeah.
you kind of die.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
ultimate enlightenment.
The cycle stops.
The cycle of suffering stops. The
Yeah.
samsara stops. You go into nirvana. But other Buddhist schools that came after, like this is called the smaller vehicle, Hinayana, and then comes Mahayana, the greater vehicle. They kind of presuppose that nirvana and so enlightenment is not something different from the world here and now, but it's actually something, a state that you can reach here and now. So again, coming back to the idea what we were talking about, mountains are mountains, and the death of the ego and stuff, so that kind of is different from what you would first think it suggests. It's more about reaching a state of wisdom in the here and now. And I think one of the nicest ideas that also correlates a lot, I think, with Stoicism is the idea of the bodhisattva. So that's the being that's not enlightened itself, and only so its main kind of mission is to help others reach enlightenment before he or she reaches his or her own enlightenment. So, and that's possibly something we can compare to someone being on a stoic path of wisdom, also trying to become wise but not being completely wise. And it's interesting also to think about the etymology of philosophy. It means befriending wisdom, basically, or love for wisdom. It's been translated often that way. But what it means is you're not yet wise.
Yeah.
Otherwise you wouldn't strive to become wise. So a philosopher is always a being, somewhere between naivete or completely not knowing and wise. And I think that the same goes for the bodhisattva in a very different context, albeit in a very different context, but kind of in simple terms and in general terms, they kind of strive to something. So it's this striving towards is very central to both.
Yeah, so that's striving towards exactly being present in both. But what's so interesting to me is that if we look at the West, the people that find themselves very drawn towards Eastern philosophy might be the more spiritual type, whereas nowadays the person that is very attracted to Stoicism in the form that is currently presented is usually the complete opposite of a spiritual person.
Yeah.
So what is it in both that attracts these completely wildly different ideas?
That's fascinating. And I think probably both groups are misguided. And
We're all misguided, probably.
yeah. No, but seriously misguided.
Yeah, okay.
I think so. The ones you mentioned, if we make stereotypes out of them, like people who go to yoga and kind of, think they're meditating, whereas they're just, trying to,
Sit
not
still.
think. Yeah, sit still. Or and to drive points home, it could even be a person who consumes a lot of spiritual things, buys crystals, whatever, spends a lot of money on their so-called spiritual journey. It has really nothing to do with the original kind of yoga. What yoga was really meant. Yoga was also like very much like the Stoics, a school where which was something you would dedicate your whole life to. So it's not something just stretch a little in the morning.
On a Tuesday night, go.
No. So, and that's how many people who are on a so-called spiritual path practice it. And there's nothing wrong with stretching. I think it's great actually, but it's not spiritual in a classical sense. So it has nothing to do with Eastern practices as they were meant. And the same goes probably for the person who thinks that he's on a Stoic path. He or she, mostly he actually, because it's no surprise, no coincidence that sometimes it's called broicism, right?
Yeah,
Have you heard of it?
yeah, of course.
So many men are attracted to it, and but it has nothing to do with Stoicism because it's self-centered. Usually, the conception of becoming successful, becoming rich, is quite the opposite. And we talked about Seneca being rich, but he said, there's really no difference in being rich or
Yeah.
poor. It's just if you had the choice, of course, it's preferable to be rich over being poor, but you don't need it to become wise. For your effort to becoming wise, to becoming stoic, you don't need it. So it's very ridiculous to think that stoicism is something you can apply to becoming rich. Of course, it can help. Probably it can help, making life a bit more bearable. But again, it probably shouldn't be called stoicism. Just like the a quasi-spiritual
Yeah.
lifestyle we just kind of described has nothing to do with the spirituality in the Eastern sense.
But Stoicism is done for the sake of itself, right? So there's no ulterior motive to it. The only reason you're doing it is for the sake of itself. So just by doing it without thinking this is going to make me rich or this is going to make me attractive, you're just doing it for the sake of doing it. That's what's actually going to improve your life, not when you're using it to attain some goal that is to fulfill your ego.
Yeah, but in another way, I mean, it is to the goal is wisdom.
Yeah.
The goal is and wisdom is characterized very differently. Stoicism is not the only school. Of course, we're talking about Stoicism now a lot, but there were many schools of philosophy, and they all had like wisdom. That was the shared goal, but the way they kind of interpreted it and strived towards it was different. So for the Stoics, wisdom was really reaching a state of ataraxia. So not being perturbed by emotions or just having a calm and clear, rational mind, basically.
So how I'm understanding it so far is that the goal is wisdom. There's an obstacle that's preventing you from reaching that wisdom.
Yeah.
And through some Stoic principles, you might be able to alleviate that obstacle a bit so you can get closer. Maybe never
Yeah.
actually reach it, but you can
Exactly.
get closer to it.
But and very important to include in that is this term of cosmic consciousness. So being cosmically conscious is an expression of wisdom, right? So and that means moving away from the self and seeing the self as something greater than your individual kind of preferences and ambitions.
And to come back to your book, what role does physicality play in that process of getting rid of that obstacle?
So what do you mean by physicality in this sense?
Well, your book is called Strijdvaardig leven, which freely translated might be something as a combative life. I think you should be careful to interpret that maybe as aggression, right? Because that's not what you're talking about. I think you're talking about more about a physicality, using your body. The body has to.
Okay, now then I understand. Yeah. That's a very central aspect, I think. And you're right to note that this warriorship. So the way of the warrior. It's a bit of could be another translation. Is really not about aggression. Quite the opposite. It's finding a way of not living an aggressive life, but a peaceful life. But it could very well be reached by practicing, extreme sports or other kind of going through extreme measures. I think Stoicism is very akin to probably a military kind of education, which is also associated with violence and aggression, but it's ultimately meant to help you not be aggressive and violent. So, and in that sense, I think training the body and disciplining the body, which can be a very extreme practice, and very difficult, making the body stronger, making it, for instance, be able to deal with extreme situations or cold training, for instance, or being able to resist the heat. Those kind of things all could be part of reaching a state of wisdom, or at least becoming wiser. But always in connection to kind of more reflective way of life. So it's always important to think about or reflect on what you're doing with your body in order to make it philosophical. Because I'm not saying, for instance, that all the people in my gym are philosophers. No, definitely not. Most of them are probably not to their discredit or anything, but they're just not busy with philosophy. But there's really something, you need to add something to the physical practice in order to characterize it as something philosophical. So I don't think just going on in the shower every morning and plunging in cold water is a philosophical action, but it could be, depending on how you kind of relate to
Is it
your
about the
training,
intention you have when you go
your
into it?
intention, your intention, and what you do with it in moments that it's necessary for. I like to give this example of, I do cold training. I enjoy doing that. Um, but what's the point, the philosophical point of doing it, Well, and this is actually something I heard of Jocko Willing. I don't know if you heard of him. But he said, like, why do we go to the gym? Well, it's of course to become stronger, and to be able to um, apply the strength when it's needed. So when you need to help someone else, for instance, someone else who needs help, well, if you have the strength to carry someone who can't walk for himself to the hospital, and that's thanks to your stamina or your strength, that's great. That's the intention you want to go to the gym with, and that's something very different from looking better in the mirror, which is probably the reason most people go to the gym. And I think the same goes for cold training or heat training. It's basically one thing could be so that you don't need room temperatures to be very high or low all the time, so you can kind of waste less resources. Another way it could be, well, if you're outside and people are cold, you can offer them some of your clothing, that you don't need because you train to resist cold. So it's basically this kind of intention of doing something good with it, if
But
needed,
I can see how that maybe my conception of wisdom should be a bit altered, because I can definitely see how that leads to being a virtuous person.
being a virtuous person.
Is that the same as that wisdom
Yeah.
that you're trying to? So it's the virtues.
Wisdom is a virtue. So
Yeah, okay, it's one of the virtues then, right?
yes, but it's probably the all-encompassing virtue. So of course, courage is another virtue. And moderation is another virtue. And discipline, etc. All these cardinal virtues. But wisdom is also one of them. But I think being reasonable or being moderate, being modest. It's also a nice one. Being righteous. It's all part of being wise ultimately.
Because I'm thinking in these concepts of trying to figure out the meaning of life and that type of stuff. But how I can see that physicality helps in that sense is in the fleeting period that I did jiu-jitsu for a couple months. I noticed that to use your mind, you have to sometimes go out of your mind. And what I mean with that is that when you're doing jiu-jitsu, it might be another sport for somebody else. There's a sense where you can lose yourself in it, where you are not in your head anymore. You're just in some flow state. And that allows you for some other times of the day to use kind of more of your mental space.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, like, it forces you to. I mean, there's in jiu-jitsu is really not much time to think. I think, and if you kind of try to work your way out a difficult position by thinking, I don't know. It's very physical thing. Like interestingly, like the parallel with chess is also made often, jiu-jitsu and chess. Um, what I'm not a chess master by any means, but I like to watch chess masters sometimes, and sometimes they kind of have this intuition, like I feel this is a good move, and they can't explain it. They just, or a move feels very bad. So it's a very emotional and physical experience that leads there way on the board. And I think it's also for jiu-jitsu. Of course, thinking sometimes helps, and it's maybe necessary to learn a more physical approach to practicing the art. But ultimately, you just have to feel what's possible and feel what's adequate and what's needed in a certain position, and feel how much strength you should apply, how much resistance, and when to tap.
Yes, that's an
Also,
important one.
knowing that that's also something needs to be trained, and not something you can think about, or it's not much point thinking about it. But what I like about what you said, so kind of it is really a moment of the day where you kind of stop working with the mind and go out of the mind a lot. Yeah.
But that again brings us back to the East, right? This concept of Wu Wei, the
Yeah.
effortless action
No.
or non-action. But personally, I like effortless action more, where you just go with the Tao pretty much. You can't be thinking about everything. You just have to go with what feels right.
But that in itself is a struggle, I think. So at least it's easy to think about it. Oh, just go with the flow, and don't resist.
You have to be forced in that situation.
Exactly, and it's a very hard way to live, and you have to kind of resist a lot, basically, because you're tempted to not go with the flow all the time.
Yeah.
So that's something you have to fight, and people. I was at a seminar where the speaker before me, who did a great job, about talking about Taoism and Wu Wei. But the audience was very surprised when they heard me with my message of, warriorship and fighting and resisting, because they thought it's the complete opposite, but it's actually not. And we ultimately, explored that a little bit more, and kind of came to the conclusion that not resisting is a form of resistance itself. But it's a gradual process, which ultimately probably leads to less resistance, and I think that also goes for Stoicism. You'll experience struggle less so, and more as something. Well, there's another challenge, something to get over with. But in order to reach this state of mind, there's a very long process, and that's just before, of training. And I think most people will probably not reach that, because it's just very, very hard, and it's easier to just not bother anymore. And I recognize that personally also. Like, it's very difficult. I get on the path and off the path all the time.
And with this combative life and the physicality, what were the Stoics' views on war? Was it something that was okay and necessary, or?
Well, Marcus Aurelius is probably the most famous person who was engaged in war.
Pretty much his whole life he was in war, right?
Life, yeah. Just something that was necessary, and also, something considered a duty. We should not forget that, as an emperor, you can't kind of, you're still part of a system. You can't transcend the system and say, let's not ever fight another war. And that's not necessarily in line with Stoic philosophy either, especially if you have to protect your people, from invasions, which was also the case in Marcus Aurelius, from Germanic tribes, I believe. So in that sense, it's not principally wrong to fight, but in the greater scheme of things, we're fighting another human being is not reasonable, in the sense that ideally the effort is towards peace and living in harmony with all other rational beings.
Again, we're looking at it with such a different point of view today, right? Because we have our cultural biases, and we can't understand what their true values were and how they looked at stuff like that.
Yeah.
But maybe one of the last topics I would like to discuss with you is to bring it back to today again, and how you look at the legacy of Stoicism versus maybe, for example, the legacy of Epicurus. Because I can sense a lot of discipline which is necessary in Stoicism. And when I think about Epicurus, I think more about hedonism. And when I look at today's society with escapism and quick thrills and seeking joy, that leads me more towards thinking that maybe not Epicurus necessarily has triumphed over Stoicism, but maybe his legacy has triumphed.
Well, let me kind of set the records straight that
Mm-hmm.
I think Epicureanism and hedonism are very difficult ways of life as
Mm-hmm.
well. And actually, there's also a great deal of struggle necessary to live as Epicurus thought his followers and students should live. So yeah,
Why do you think that?
so hedonism, the meaning of hedonism has changed over the centuries a lot. So what you refer to as hedonism now, I recognize, but it is very far from hedonism of Epicurus. Hedonism in his time, or in his kind of what he meant by hedone, enjoyment, was that we should learn to enjoy simple things. So enjoy a glass of water when you're thirsty and some bread when you're hungry, and not strive to anything else, than that. And the highest kind of form of enjoyment is probably from friendship, from
Mm.
relating to friends, having good relationships with other people. So that's really nothing to do with this idea of escapism or consumerism or just, trying to have these quick kind of satisfaction moments in your life. It's really about neglecting those kind of things and negating the tempting kind of quick pleasures. And instead of that, trying to cultivate a stronger and more lasting kind of pleasure that you can always summon, even in painful situations. So the greatest example is probably Epicurus on his deathbed. So he suffered from this stomach disease. Must have been in great pain, but he kind of said like to deal with the pain, he just needed memories from the good friends that he had and the great moments that he shared with his friends. And there's really nothing not any money involved or not any of the hedonism we think of today
Yeah.
involved in that kind of enjoyment. So that's just very important to see how different hedonism was back then, and so to think that Epicurus won the battle is really not the case. He lost the battle.
Really, I guess. But so there's actually quite a strong link then I can see between Epicurus and Stoicism
Yeah, there is.
in the fact that for me to enjoy this glass of water as much as possible, I might have to completely exhaust myself first.
Yes, there is. Yeah.
Mm.
So there's many similarities. There's also some differences, and then Seneca wrote about them a lot. But what's funny, so Stoics attacked people who followed the hedonistic schools, but they probably attacked them most for things that had nothing to do with hedonism. And back then there was also people, who ate too much, for instance, who just enjoyed eating, sweet things and whatever is not healthy for us. And those were criticized by Stoics, but they were not true hedonists in the Epicurean sense, because Epicurus never, recommended a way of life in that sense. So it's very different, and that's why Seneca also draws a lot of lessons from Epicurus directly, and he refers to him in his essays. Like Epicurus was right to think blah 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 blah. In his early essays, he
Do you
did
have
it a
an
lot.
example of what he references from Epicurus?
I think the kind of this emphasis on simplicity is definitely something that fits in the Stoic idea of the Stoic ideal. You don't need much to be happy or wise, and it's a great art to be capable of enjoying simple things.
Mm. Is it also about somehow resetting what makes you happy?
Yeah,
So for me, for example, once I did a 3-day fast. The first bite of food you have after that again
right.
is incredible. So is Stoicism also about just resetting all the time, just resetting that happiness
Yeah,
so that you can be happy with little?
yeah, yeah. I think that's a great example, and Well, also one that would fit in the hedonistic school.
Hmm.
So, but it's about this controlled kind of suffering, and not walking away from suffering, but actually embracing it in a way that it can, you get used to it. Because life, it is always inherently involved with suffering one way or another. I mean, it's the first Buddhist principle, life is suffering, and anyone with a little bit of experience can kind of relate to that, and it knows it's true. We all suffer. Some people suffer more obviously than others, but we all suffer.
Mm.
Even people who are, who seem to be very well off suffer. I mean, it's very obvious. Even super rich want to become richer, so it's not never, it never ends.
Yeah.
But what we then tend to do is we walk away. We try to walk away from suffering, make our lives more comfortable, and which only probably creates more suffering, because
Mm.
we need more to make more comfortable lives. Whereas, these schools of thought and schools of philosophy, you kind of recommend to not strive for more comfort, but do the opposite, like
Yeah.
put yourself in difficult and challenging situations and then become a better, stronger person in a physical and a philosophical, and a mental sense. And then life will, the amount of suffering will decrease. And that's a very interesting kind of approach. And I think that, also jujitsu is a great way to do that. Not the only way, and there's definitely more needed. But jujitsu is a controlled suffering all the way. It's I suffer a lot on the mats, and I not always enjoy it, honestly. But I do feel that I become a happier person when suffering
Yeah, what I've
in that
thought
sense.
about it when I did jujitsu as well, and I don't think it makes you more happy, but it kind of makes the bad things that happen in your
Yeah,
day less bad, which leaves more space for happiness
right,
throughout
right. That's
throughout the
well
day.
put. I agree.
Um, just to round off the conversation, maybe we can talk a little bit about your book, An Oefening in Leven. I think an exercise in life might
Yeah,
be a translation for it. I know it's not, there's no life hacks when it comes to Stoicism, but when people are trying to set out on a path towards that knowledge, that wisdom in Stoicism, what is something you would recommend? Is it starting doing jujitsu for something like that, for example?
yeah, for sure. I mean, but it depends on a person's context. I think that's
Mm.
the most important thing to first look and contemplate on who you are. Doing self investigation,
Mm.
and that's also why I start. The first chapter is all about the importance of finding out who you are, what you stand for, and then also like a doctor does, like diagnosing an illness, like see what's not so good, what's
Mm.
not going great in your life, where in what sense are there any weaknesses that need to be addressed. So for me, jiu-jitsu is a great way, because it helps me grow in lots of different ways, but I can imagine that not being the case for everyone. So that's why first someone needs to find what's necessary to address. And Epictetus writes about this a lot. He and actually another figure we haven't spoken about, Plutarch. He's not a Stoic philosopher, but he was very well aware of Stoics, and he wrote about Stoicism, and also certainly has some Stoic aspects to his own way of life and recommendations. But he conjures this example of a person who talks too much, a person who just talks and talks and talks all the time. So knowing this about yourself
Mhm.
could kind of help you arrive at the conclusion that you need to talk less and become,
Mm.
more sensitive to the situations you are in and what's wanted and not
It
wanted,
starts you out on a path.
and start you out on the path. So, and then you kind of look for ways to train that. Because I think so. The emphasis in this book, An Exercise in Living, is that hearing or reading about it is one thing. But it's not enough to really transform uh, yourself.
Mhm.
And in order to arrive at transformation, of your character, of ultimately who you are, it's a gradual process that needs lots of training, like jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
In order to progress, you need to come to the gym all the time and keep training and take lessons. And
I think that's one of the critiques of meditations as well, right? That it's so repetitive.
yeah,
But I think that's the whole point.
yeah,
It's like in jiu-jitsu, you drill a certain move over and over and over again, and then you become
absolutely. Yeah,
fluent in it.
yeah,
And it's the same, I guess, with reading. You have to just read it over and over and over again, and then it might set up a
yeah.
spark and
It
you
might
actually start. It
exactly.
might, for sure, but
But and the importance is also that there's many things you can do, and many people think that philosophy is just about reading books.
Mhm.
So it is just one aspect of it, And I try to kind of show what other ways there are to relate to philosophy. So we've been talking a lot about jiu-jitsu because that's
Yeah.
also a way of practicing philosophy in my understanding of it. And then the subtitle of the book is Philosophy as a Craft, and by that I want to kind of suggest that mm, learning or reaching mastership in any craft just requires a lot of training, and there's just a whole way that you need to put yourself on a journey, in in order to reach it. But you will probably not. But at least you strive towards this wisdom, this idea of wisdom. But just don't think that you can transform from one day to another.
Yeah.
I think that's just the most important message. And it's not, it's not to discourage people, but just to do a reality check, And if you really want this, you really need dedication.
Mm.
And it's fine. It's fun also, It's fun to do things with dedication, but just don't think that it's easy, as popular writers want you to believe, because that's
Yeah.
obviously the way they can sell their books. It's just not so popular to write a book and to basically say it's very difficult to become stoic. You can, but
That's not a great sales pitch. No, it's you're probably not gonna do it. It's not gonna happen for you. It's going to be super difficult.
and so it's way more profitable to say the opposite, but
10
it's not
steps
true.
and you'll get there.
Yeah, but that's not true.
I mean, what you said about diagnosing the problem, I don't know if it's a quote by one of the Stoics, but one of the quotes I love the most is that if you don't know which port you're sailing to, no wind is favorable.
Hmm.
That's really, you first have to know which way you have to go, and then you can start setting out on that path. But first, you need to figure out which way that even is,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. So I don't know either, but I like it a
Mhm.
lot, and it certainly also seems to stress the idea I put forward that first you need to know who you are and decide what's needed to do in your life.
But if people read your book, they should read it at least like 10 times to really get it into their.
Well, yeah, but I also recommend reading primary sources.
Yeah.
But I also would like to say, like, don't limit yourself to reading only, because I've been studying this and teaching about it and reading a lot about it and writing about it, but that has not really changed a lot.
Yeah.
I actually, before writing my first book, I was already teaching about Stoicism, maybe 10 years.
Mhm.
And then when I really did a reality check with myself and like started to think about, but what, how has this really changed my life?
Mhm.
Not that much really. And that's only because I've been teaching and talking about it, but I've not really trained it, And so that's why exercise is such a pivotal term in the book title. You have to exercise it, and exercise presupposes a certain approach to philosophy. It presupposes repetition, it presupposes discipline, and dedication. Yeah,
And it's also not a great sales pitch, but it is the truth that it's not gonna overnight drastically
no,
improve your life. It's gonna slowly, very slightly, maybe make some things a bit easier, but you can't expect too much.
no. And it's like in the beginning, if you're very new to these ideas, then of course it might be the case that you kind of read Seneca or Marcus Aurelius and think, wow, and the next day you start doing things differently. But in order to it really transform you and to make it like something natural, a second nature, a habit, there's much more needed because it's more like, going to the gym after a period of not having trained a lot,
Mhm.
and then you go 4 or 5 times a week, but you will never keep doing that, So and then you lose motivation again, and you kind of stop going altogether.
Mhm.
And that's I think the trap many
Yeah.
people can fall into. Like they read a book or they attend. A lecture about Stoicism, think it's great, thinks it's very interesting, talk about it on a birthday, and then forget about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to round everything off, I think that's the most important thing we can take from any primary source about Stoicism is that you can't just read them once and expect them to change your life. You have to live with them. You have to live with the books, pick them up every now and then, just reread stuff, underline, really start to live with them and start to feel what they actually trying to bring across to you. I think that's the main point of them.
Couldn't agree more. And then, Seneca, he recommends not having many books, but just rereading
Yeah,
books a lot. And that's
I think
really a
there's some
training in
wisdom in that for
itself.
sure. Yeah.
So, but we're not used to doing that. I mean, if you read a book, you consider it read, and then
Yeah.
you move to
Forget
the
about
next
it.
book. It's
The next one.
why waste time on reading the same book again? But that's really training. Is
That's where the most value lies
Yeah,
as well.
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation. Is there anything new you're working on? Any new books that are coming up? Or
No, so books are not coming up anytime soon, but that's because I feel like I have said the most important things about it right now. Of course, as I progress in my own life and gain new experiences, I think I will also arrive at new insights.
Mhm.
But to be honest, I think two books is really much. You don't need much more to understand it, at least, and to see there's interesting parallels and aspects of it. But then it's really about training and doing it. And I think it would be more interesting than to write a book. I would really like to start a school or something
Hmm.
and to train together with other people.
What would that school look like?
This is something I haven't worked out yet because the, but for sure, I mean, it would be a community,
Mm,
of people, and there would be many room for discussion, for different insights. Not a strong hierarchical
mhm,
structure, but yeah, something a space where you can learn from each other. I have done summer schools in Leusden at the International School for Philosophy, and that's probably something that it does get close to what I would have in mind as an ideal. I'm not working on
mhm,
it right now. But that's just spending a lot of time with people in a short period, and then getting to know each other really well and training together,
mm.
designing exercises, and then carrying them out and see what works, what doesn't work. Like as in that sense, it's really a school where you experiment a lot. Yeah.
Mm. So combining the intellectual pursuits with physical
Yeah,
pursuits.
yeah. And during those summer schools, I also invited many teachers from different disciplines,
Mhm,
like karate teachers. I had experts who took us out, foraging or,
mhm.
spending time in nature, these kind of things, and combining, all the interesting aspects of different disciplines.
Well, again, thanks so much for the conversation. Sounds amazing. I hope it comes to fruition soon. That would be very nice. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you.